Thank you, Danielle, and I appreciate the introduction. It's wonderful for me to be here, and one of the things I love about this conference is that it's just a great example of the mission of both the University of San Francisco as a Jesuit Catholic institution and the School of Management. If you see any of our banner flags around the city, you'll see that our motto is "Change the World from Here." But when I'm talking about our mission, I usually like to change a little bit, and I usually like to say, change the world for good from here. And that's really what this conference is about. I mean, don't get me wrong, in the School of Management, we want all of our graduates to be able to go out and earn a healthy salary, hopefully contribute some of that money back to the university when they become successful and have paid off their student loans. But it's much more than that, and we want them to be able to go out there and do work that's not just going to enrich stockholders, not just going to enrich venture capitalists, but in fact is going to enrich the communities in which they choose to live. And that's what this afternoon is about. We've got a number of great panels with people talking to you about how the work that we can do around business and entrepreneurship can really help and enrich our communities in a way that helps to ensure that the riches are spread among a wide swath of people and not heading in the direction of more income inequality as we have in this country and have been going for a couple of decades now. So again, I want to welcome all of you for being here. I hope you will engage and participate in the discussions this afternoon and enjoy your time. Thank you. And my most important duty is to introduce to you the Dean of the School of Management, Elizabeth Davis. Dean Davis.
Thanks, Don. Hello, everybody. I'm Liz Davis, Dean of the School of Management, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our fourth annual Innovate for Good conference. This year in collaboration with the Commonwealth Club. We're really glad you could take the time to join us today for a really exciting afternoon of discussions really around social innovation and leaders on the landscape. A few words about this conference. The conference is funded by the Harari Fund for Ethical Leadership and Social Innovation at USF. And they've funded this Innovate for Good for the last 4 years. The conference itself was made possible through an endowment from Alan Davis and Mary Lou Dowray, honoring the work of Dr. Oren Harari, who was a faculty member in the School of Management. Dr. Harari was really a compassionate and very driven educator, an inspirational consultant to many, and an internationally renowned for his work in strategy and leadership as a scholar. His work in the business community really emphasized strategic transformational leadership with a focus on globalization, technology, and innovation. As part of the Harari legacy, this conference was designed promoting innovative leadership for social benefit, a direct embodiment of the university's mission. In other words, a leadership perspective that really emphasizes producing greater stakeholder value. So today's conference brings together business, government, nonprofit leaders to really discuss sustainable business practices, social impact investing, and social innovation in our cities and the environment. The afternoon, I think, really promises to be a very rich dialogue on public-private partnerships, the transformation of organizations, and also an opportunity to inspire our School of Management students to become change-driven, courageous, inclusive, optimistic, and performance-focused leaders, ones that Dr. Harari really envisioned. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Commonwealth Club, George and Kimberly, for being our tireless partners in this conference. Also, a thank you to Billy Riggs for chairing, and to Danielle, Susan, and Michelle for coordination of the event. We really want to make this day an experience for our students, alumni, faculty, and friends of the university to continue the important conversations and drive innovation in our city, San Francisco. So we hope that you enjoy this afternoon adventure. And now I'll turn this over to Billy Riggs to give you an overview of the day. Billy?
Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm a professor of management, as was described, and as someone who's built a career kind of focused on urban systems, I couldn't be more excited about being here and talking about kind of all of these different connectivities we have in a place like San Francisco, but also globally. So we're going to talk about innovating for good, and I think a lot of our dialogue today will be about cities and celebrating leadership and social innovation in them. So as we get settled, I just want to make some logistical announcements, but before we do so, we're going to try to keep things fairly interactive today. And so given that I come from a background and worked as an engineering technician for the Coast Guard when I first came here to the Bay Area, I want to actually take it back to my roots, which is transport. If you have one of these newfangled devices that connects to the internet, or if you still have one of these phones that has a dial pad, what we'd like to do is to get some pulse in terms of how you might have got here this morning. Did you walk? Did you take a horse and buggy? Did you take a boat or ferry? Some of you may have seen this when you walked in, but so if you want to cue that up right now, we should see that online. And if you already passed that, you may actually see that. We also want to take a pulse in terms of what you feel like innovation for good means. And I think that what we're doing now is we're going to do some social norming. We're going to actually test kind of where we are, and we'll come back to this. Did anybody say? Okay, so we may actually be cued past this in your devices. As we start off, let's just look and see kind of what we see here emerging. Is this emblematic of what we believe as a group? Oh, look, we got some emojis popping up. I think a lot of what we'll see today really will be focused on this idea of innovation, but how do we preserve the things that we value, the things that bring us smiles, the things that bring us community. So with that, I think what I would like to do is just kind of go through some logistics, and we'll still see this populate. It's going to be very quick and very interactive today. So what I'd like you to do, if you need to step outside and take a call, if you need to do something, just try to be as courteous as you can. We'd like all of your phones to be on silent. Clearly, I'm encouraging you to use them. But also, we just want to keep things rolling and be as respectful of this environment as we can. So do that. Our flow for the day will be as such. We're going to have 2 panels back to back after we hear from Professor Davis and Dean Davis, as well as MTC Director, brand new Executive Director, Therese McMillan. Before they come up, though, I just think it's important to also emphasize that you do have comment cards on all of your seats. And what I'd like you to do, if you have a question, a burning question during this talk, we're going to be roaming through the aisles. Write it down. We'd love to actually entertain those. And we'll bring it up. We'll be able to actually prioritize and sort through those. Every panel will be able to take some time for audience Q&A, but we'd like those to be on cards so we can be as efficient as possible. So with that said, I think it's time for me to introduce both Dean Davis as well as Executive Director McMillan. And so just let me just properly introduce Dean Davis, because she was the first female dean in the 95-year history of USF. She's proper, and I think you're going to see a very strong female contingency here today. She's an expert in strategic management and organizational dynamics. She graduated of Bernard, as well as her doctorate from Wharton in Pennsylvania. So Dean Davis, if you wouldn't mind coming up for a chat with someone who we're very happy to have back here in the Bay Area. Come on up, Therese McMillan. Therese had a 20-year career, 20-plus year, I believe, with MTC, which is our regional governing body, basically for transportation, and now really for housing and land use issues. So you can think of her as kind of the glue that holds all of our disparate cities together here in the Bay Area. I'm going to leave it at that and let you all have a dialogue, but let's just welcome them with a hand clap, and thank all of you for being here as well.
All right.
Thank you, Billy. And we'll be watching for the cloud as it changes over these next couple of hours. So keep using your phones and entering so that we have a sense of where people are over the next couple of hours. Today is a real opportunity to really kick off this afternoon event by really talking with Therese McMillan, who is the new Executive Director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And really, let me start, Therese, by asking you, well, first of all, welcome you back to the Bay Area as the new executive director, and ask you how it feels to be back, really where it all began. And then also, maybe you could give the audience a feel for what the Metropolitan Transportation Commission is all about. So let's start there.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Liz, and thank you all for having me here. It was 25 years, so a quarter century, we can admit to that I worked with MTC. I joined them right after I got out of grad school at Cal, and had gotten my, go Bears, had gotten my dual degree in city and regional planning and civil engineering science and transportation. Oh. And so, over those 25 years, and living in the Bay Area and actually raising a family in the Bay Area, one of the things that I learned immediately was how to manage in a diverse and complex institutional and political environment. In the long arc of MTC's portfolio, and they did a lot. I started out in transit coordination and assistance, then went into long-range planning, air quality planning, managed funding and all the grants, hundreds of millions of dollars that went to all of our different transit organizations, did legislation, and in the last 9 years sort of pulled that all together as the deputy executive of policy. So that was, a unique experience insofar as a MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, and there's many of them across the country. MTC had a much bigger portfolio to work with, some by state statute and our enabling legislation, but I think also the fact that it was in an area that was as complex and diverse as the 9-county Bay Area. And I think we'll get to that in another question. So with that background, then going to Washington, D.C. was really interesting because being on the national stage, on the one hand, wasn't as intimidating as it might have been because I'd had this experience with diverse and complex organizations. But I quickly learned, quickly, that national policy is really hard, right? I mean, I had been the one, like anyone else, I could just get my projects done so much more quickly if we didn't have this big bureaucratic government and, federal government in place. And then once I'm on the other side going, I get it now, right? Like OMB, yes, Office of Management and Budget, it changes your life once you figure out what that is. But the point there was that you had to make national policy that worked in a Native American reservation in South Dakota, in Alaska, in Arizona, in New York. And I dealt with all of it. And so that was a very humbling as well as empowering place to be, to appreciate that you could make impactful change, but that it was really difficult, and to appreciate that. So having, and we can touch on some specifics particularly, but then moving from there to Los Angeles Metro was another interesting circle in the arc. I was born and raised in LA. So kind of coming home in that regard was really interesting. I had not lived in LA for 30 years, and that was a city that had foundationally changed, particularly after the recession. One of the things that, though, was really important for me, and it gets to this equity focus that's such an important part of this conference, was the first time I'd worked actually for an agency that had to deliver service on the street. I was working for the third largest transit operator in the country. Most people don't know that. LA is the third largest transit agency in the country. And when you have to get the buses on the road, deal with the trains being on time, dealing with things that can affect people's lives just in time, it changes the culture of an organization. It changes how you make decisions. You realize you don't have time to vet everything 16 ways to Sunday. Sometimes you just need to make it and go. And so being able to do that and manage risk in a very different way was extremely helpful. Now coming back to MTC to figure out how our policy wraps around the reality of actually doing things. So it's a very interesting arc for me to have.
So you've really sort of migrated on the front end of your career by sort of the operational aspects of some of these very complex problems, which you really had to handle, moving then to the policy side and trying to develop national policy to solve some of these really complex issues. Try to solve, yes, only to come back around and try again in Los Angeles. So now you're back in the Bay Area.
Back.
You're
Yes.
back, right? And you have a very, very long history of really managing complex organizations, but also dealing with very complex problems. So can you, for the sake of the audience, talk a little bit about what you think are the most unique aspects of really MTC, or the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. What makes that so unique as an organization, and really comment on that?
From an organizational standpoint, and again, I think this conference is going to be very interesting in terms of looking at the nature of institutions and organizations and then what they're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And how that relationship works. At least for MTC, one of the things that was evident, certainly in the 25 years that I was there, was that unlike many other MPOs, we were richly resourced. There was a lot of actual funding and money available to us to do things. And that was a very unique circumstance from the way that we were set up under our state enabling statute. Without getting into all the weeds there, but that expanded dramatically at the point we also became the Bay Area Toll Authority and took over the funding and finance of the 7 state-owned toll bridges in the 9 county San Francisco Bay Area. So that was a huge leap and change for the organization. Because we had skin in the game, we had influence in ways that a lot of other planning organizations didn't. And I was actually, interestingly, part of a big discussion about how to improve MPOs and their impact as part of the Obama administration and under Secretary Anthony Fox. They had a deep interest in there. And I kept coming back to the point, but if they don't have resources to influence decisions, it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
And I think that's just proved, true time and time again. The second thing is that we have a lot of regional talent in this area. I mean, just look at the number of, academic institutions that are here. The staff we have are incredibly talented. They come from, all over the country, but mostly a lot of it, from here. And there's an opportunity, although we'll talk about that opportunity not being available to all, but there is certainly a richness of professionals, organizations, academic and professionally, the environment here is pretty unique. And it gave us a presence on the state and federal stage that was really important. People knew us and listened to us in ways, I think, that were different because of where we came from and
interesting.
The mix of, our commissioners and the like. Third is that's unique, I think, to MTC. Well, I've come to realize not as unique as I like to think when I got out the bubble of when going so that was one of the things, going to the federal government. People said, I know you're from San Francisco, but you're not as special as you think. So that was a good thing. It was a good thing. But one of the things that was really important also about being in this complex environment, we were forced to partner and continue to be forced to partner in ways that are very different than other areas of the country. So as an example, in LA is as complicated as the Bay Area. There's 88 cities in LA County. One single county is as large and has more people and has almost as many cities as the San Francisco Bay Area. But it's the city of Los Angeles is a very dominant force in a way that we don't see that same dynamic here. So there's a sharing of and shifting of power and influence that has forced people to have to collaborate. How well we've done could be discussed, but it's always been there. And I think that unique sort of force field of partnership is something that's interesting.
Yeah, I think that really is true. Unlike a lot of other cities, having been here in the Bay Area and dealing with and talking with different organizations, whether it's the academic institutions, local business, or nonprofits, there is a different sort of dynamic here that you don't find. So it isn't so much the city of San Francisco as much as it really is the collaboration around the Bay that really makes things happen. And MTC is right in the middle of all of that.
Right.
Well, one of the things, this whole conference that we've done over the past couple of years, we've really focused on, innovate for good. And from an MTC standpoint, what does Innovate for Good mean to you as the executive director now of MTC, and given what you've seen in your experience?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to unpack that question very carefully, Liz, because there's two key things there that as I thought about it, were really meaningful to me. The first is, what does good mean? And I'm very unequivocal on that point. Good is improving the lives of the people who live here, and especially for those that are less fortunate and have been historically underserved. I think it's that simple for me. At the end of the day, that's the metric about what we do as good. Now, that may be to some degree a very public sector perspective, but it's one that in my comments I'll challenge we all need to have. And I think, we can turn to that. With respect to Innovate, I thought about that too, because innovation can be tossed around in many different ways. So for me and the portfolio that MTC has, which is much more complex than it used to be, let me just touch on three things. One, there's Innovate from the point of view of technology. That's what everyone loves to talk about and get to. And in transportation, it's, automated vehicles, and it's alternative fuels, and it's, the consumer apps that are changing the face of service delivery, and it's all that. But there's a couple of things, though, that are very interesting in that space. One is the challenge of the rapidity of the change. Because when you are particularly in the public sector, keeping up with it is a huge challenge. And it gets to something, again, that when we talk about institutions and how the public and private sector relate or don't, there's a friction there that is important to think through. The second observation on the technology side is, this whole idea of disruption. Okay? You can tell I have some thoughts about that. But the main thing for me is that disruption generally means something breaks. And when something breaks, there's damage left behind, and who's accountable for that? That's the question that I think is really important when we're thinking about this disruptive change. That's fine, and many times that requires us to advance, but it's never clean. And I think we just need to be important there. And quickly, the two other things on financing or funding, I think innovation there is huge. We have complex projects, none of which have a single funding source ever now, when you're talking generally now billions of dollars to deliver. And it means that the kinds of funding packages that need to be brought together and the financing that's attached to that and whatnot is very, very different. Public-private partnerships are shifting greatly in that space. And then, innovation and governance, I think, is a huge part of what innovation needs to tackle. Who is at the table to influence decisions and who's making them? And importantly, who's not at the table and why, and how do you get them there? So right now, MTC, importantly, is tackling a very real governance challenge or mandate relative to the institution of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and then the Association of Area Governments was a separate organization. And to overly simplify transportation and land use, of course, all of these things are being tied together right now. And the staffs are now combined, and the two governing boards will be considering what does possibly a new regional governance look like. And I think it's a key time, given this topic and what we're dealing with here, for that conversation to take place.
Well, one of the things, two of the things that you identified, for MTC, and really sort of this whole idea of innovating for good, are keeping up, right? And also this idea of disruption. MTC is going to have a lot of challenges sort of going forward, and we had talked a little bit about this. So I want to ask you what you think are some of the key challenges for MTC beyond just simply keeping up and the disruption, new standards being developed almost every day. Recently, the Mercury News and Silicon Valley Leadership Group went out and solicited and did a poll on the Bay Area, rating problems facing the Bay Area as extremely serious or very serious, somewhat serious. And at the top of that list, people responded by identifying housing, the cost of living, homelessness, and traffic congestions. Are these the kinds of things that MTC will take on, or are really sort of what you would see as key challenges for building partnerships?
I take that almost as a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
No, and I
Talk about a lead.
right, and not to make light of any of it, because it's huge. It's huge. I mean, I was thinking about what's changed in the 10 years since I came back.
Right.
And the housing situation is just insane.
Yeah.
I there's almost not enough adjectives to try to describe what that is. And, I'll just use a really personal example. Ironically, I was in Los Angeles, and the LA Times had an article about the housing in San Francisco. So, but, we're all one state, happy family.
Not
But I
so
sent
much.
I sent that link to both of my daughters and said, you both need to think that you may not be able to come home to live. You may not be able to afford to come here. You can come and live with Dad and I again, but just start getting your head around the fact that may not be in your immediate future. And that made me very sad.
Yeah.
It made me very sad. And I think for any of you who have, children or relatives or friends, they're struggling. There's a whole cadre that gets a lot of attention that aren't, but there's a huge generation that is, and they're here, or they want to be here. And so housing, it just is. It is the topic in Sacramento right now. There's hundreds of bills, literally, that are dealing with housing. It is an issue. This region, before I came under the former executive director, Steve Heminger, had done some very front-facing work called the CASA Initiative, looking at some very bold proposals of how to begin to deal with the preservation and the protections and the production challenges associated with housing. A number of those themes are being carried forward right now in terms of framing bills and legislation around it, and we will be front and center leading that. In fact, I'm, with my team and my commissioners initiating a housing legislative working group that will be evaluating every single week from now through at least mid-May what these Sacramento bills look like and what they might mean for this region. I mean, it's that central.
Right.
On transport, again, that's kind of my wheelhouse. I guess that's a really cute analogy, right? Wheelhouse. But transportation, uh, it's, again, one of those complex issues, and I'm
Right.
sensitive to the fact there's a lot of folks going, why isn't it better? 10 years in, it's not better. Well, there's a lot of reasons why it's not, quote, better. Maybe because there's a lot more people and more jobs, thousands and thousands and thousands of more jobs. There's limited, geographic space. There's all those things, not as excuses, but just to illustrate the fact that these moving people around this region
Yeah.
is incredibly difficult. We don't have enough money for the infrastructure. We're struggling, as many urban areas are, with underwriting and repairing what we have.
Right.
And then having to deal with needing to do a lot more. And on top of that, what we just talked about, the technologies and options changing under our feet.
Right.
So it's incredibly exciting. But I think it speaks to a different way of policy making that's going to be something that hopefully, I'll be able to work with lots of partners to get my heads around. Let me just mention a couple of other things. Economic disparity,
Yeah.
it's just there, and we have to deal with it. Climate-driven impacts, lest we forget. We're at the Bay, and what do we have? Like record drought, and then when is it going to stop raining? So, for California itself, just in the span of 2 years, you've seen these massive swings that, speak to those natural ecological challenges. So I think with all of that, the greatest challenge is not the subject, but how we approach them. And I think we have to evaluate, plan for, and deliver within the intersectionality of those issues. You cannot talk about transportation without talking about housing. You can't talk about housing without talking about jobs. You can't talk about jobs without the state of education. It's all linked together. And if we need to get out of our silos and start approaching these problems in a deliberate, intersectional way,
Right.
if we're going to really deal with them. So
You really, have to adopt almost a systems approach to dealing with the problems. But the other thing that, in advance of this conversation, Teresa and I talked a little bit about this. And one of the other things that you really thematically identified as one of the key challenges is just the theme itself of access and equity. While you have the movement of the technology and we have housing problems and it's all systemic, it's really a challenge of how do you provide access for everybody and equity as well. So how can we then, in the face of all these highly complex situations and issues, innovate and lead in the face of those challenges? What is the spearhead of that and the inspiration that you'll bring to helping us solve some of these really complex problems?
I found in my career that when you have complex issues, you can get overwhelmed with them very quickly.
Yeah.
And you can fall into the trap of trying to do everything at the same time, which basically means you just spin and don't really move forward at all. So, it breaks down for me as you have to stop and set really clear objectives and frame a game plan, and that game plan has to be about priorities and making choices and realizing you will have trade-offs. We are in a resource-constrained environment, and you will have trade-offs. That's why something like equity is so critical, to have that as an objective at the front end, not the back. Too often what's happened is we make decisions and find out that someone either has not been served or has been hurt, and we mitigate it. Okay, that was the delivering transportation projects. That was sort of the thing. That was the way we did it with CEQA and NEPA and that type of approach. And I think we're backing out of that to go, no. We have to think about people at the front end of every single decision. And so that's a foundational thing. The other thing, and it sounds trite, except it's really hard because I keep trying to do it 35 years in, is break down silos, or as I'm fond of saying, our cylinders of excellence. We can do it. We can reach across. So, that again is something though that has to be very deliberate. And one of the interesting things that I found in my work at FTA and at LA Metro, now I'm asking the question here at MTC, is being humble enough in some ways to say, where do you lead and then where do you partner?
Yeah.
Okay? And thinking about that up front is really important. And admitting sometimes you might not be the best person to lead, but you could bring something incredibly valuable to the partnership of getting something done. So I think that's a key part. Embrace flexibility and risk-taking. And I'll just say, for public sector, that's really hard.
Yeah.
Because traditionally, the private sector has had a lot more room to take risks than the public sector ever has. The private, you have venture capital and startups and profits that, depending on where you go, kind of doesn't matter how you get there as long as you have that bottom line. The public sector has never had that luxury. If you mess up, you are held accountable in a very visible, unforgiving way. That's just the way that it's been. And unless we change that, unless the public sector is also able to try things out, maybe to stumble, but learn from that and change and not be vilified for it, if we don't change that, the government and the public sector has very little motivation to take risk and try and innovate. So I think that's something we need to think about of how that can be, built into how we work. And then finally, and this is really important, build trust with the public.
Yeah.
We have to consciously want to do that. And that's as much, viewing outcomes from the standpoint of the customer experience, not from how well your institution does. That's a start. Second, there is, come up with a common language explaining why you're doing what you're doing. And, basically be accountable to the people you serve.
So, really being a risk taker, but at the same time, your role has been to absorb a lot of the risk and the fallout for others who've sort of moved ahead. So the challenge is, how do you actually collaborate and not just absorb all the risk from everything around you, and then build that public trust with the customers so that they really can rely on MTC to help do the right thing in service to the customer. So we are at the end of our time. I have some questions now from the audience that I'd like to move to at this point. And so let me start with transportation. One of our guests in the audience would like to hear a comment on what's happening with the bullet train project. From LAX to
I should have taken
SFO. Knowing that you've been in both places, we are hoping you'll solve this problem.
Oh, yeah.
So tell us what
High-speed
you're
rail.
thinking.
Okay, I'm not going to try to. I'm not going to. What's the right term? I'm going to tread this very carefully.
Yes. Tread lightly.
Well, I would say this, particularly at LA Metro, because with Measure M and the massive capital program that they were able to launch in terms of building, particularly building out rail, but also revamping the bus and everything. Union Station was a center point, right? And what we had to do was design not to preclude high-speed rail. And it was an interesting exercise because, of course, we're trying to bring other things like into this very fixed physical space and at the same time keep room for this incredibly important mobility initiative for the state at a time when schedule and funding are huge question marks.
Yeah.
So I point to that to say I think that's the same thing that's going to happen here. And I want to go back to my point about flexibility and the need to pivot to circumstance.
Yep.
I have to write that down. Pivot to circumstance. The governor, I think, is bringing a very key sensibility to wrapping our arms about what we can deliver to the public. I think
Right.
that's been a major challenge with the project.
Right.
It's extremely complex. It's huge. It's huge.
It's huge.
And I think for the Bay Area, one of the things that we will need to do, similar down to LA, is look at, and it's something I'm going to direct my staff to do, just look at all of our projects and programs and say, where did we anticipate the connections to be?
Right.
Just down the street, right? We built the box under the Transbay Terminal for it. But just to lay that out and say, if this is still an unknown, what can we do to work around it that doesn't preclude it, but also doesn't
Right.
stifle
Right.
making improvements we have to do now?
Right.
That's going to be our challenge, basically.
Right. Well, in the context of, the very complicated transportation issues, I mean, the audience has several different questions related to this. So it's not just what's the status of, the bullet train. It's everything from, do you really support, for example, congestion pricing like New York? Because in the absence of, a definitive answer, let's say on the bullet train, we still have congestion. And what will we do about that? Is that something MTC will even consider, this whole idea of congestion pricing? And then correspondingly, what's on deck for new modes of transportation, sort of expanded routes? I mean, it's a highly complex issue. Can you comment
Yeah.
on any of that?
So, for anyone who's ever been in a leadership role, the one thing is who really makes the decisions. And Therese McMillan, as executive director, reports to her board.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's an important point.
Very important point.
It's a very important point.
Yes.
And the board, my two boards now, ABAG and the commissioners,
Yep.
as public elected officials, in the main are also have a responsibility to everyone who's living here. So I see that, again, it's important to always remember that context. That in the public sector, you have to remember that's where the decision-making structure happens. That said, one of the things, there's a couple of things that I have found that I would hopefully bring in my role as executive director are, for them to make the best decisions, they need lots of reliable information, and they need choices, and they need tools. That's going to make their decisions work better every single time. So with congestion pricing, again, we need to do the best job we can to bring information. Where does it work well? What are the impacts? What's been the experience? How might it, everyone, where it's been done, it's, what's different about Singapore and Stockholm compared to San Francisco, right? And be able to illustrate that. That's important. In terms of choices, I think you always have to have choices. The one thing that has never served anyone well is to say there is only one way and it's a straight line from A to B.
Yeah.
Because probably that's not going to happen,
Yep.
right? So again, something like congestion pricing is something in a toolbox to say it has potential.
Yeah.
But what are all the steps we need to take to get there? And let's talk about them, including things like who would it impact, pro and con, in terms of the fact that it is a pricing mechanism. At the same time, I don't think we also have to be bold enough and risk-taking enough, which is often hard for the public sector, to look at these different things and go, let's not dismiss it out of hand because it's different, right? Because because we don't know everything. I think we've got to push ourselves to get into that space of discomfort and be able to take the risks, and if it doesn't pan out, be able to respond to whatever fallout came of that, regroup, and move ahead.
So now in the face of, once again, all these highly complex issues, and And on a landscape where you're hearing from so many different leaders in so many different sectors, you know, the audience really wants to know is how do you personally, and this is true, we had this conversation before this interview that we're doing today. One of the things that Therese really talked about was how central sort of the issues of equity and access are for her. So, you know, how do you personally sort of keep the value structure sort of moving in the right direction at the end of the day with so many people sort of coming at you? Can you comment on that? What keeps you sane? Is it yoga?
It is yoga. No,
There you go.
no, and I have to say, there's a lot of choices for yoga in the San Francisco Bay Area, so that's a good thing. You know,
How do you stay
many
centered?
years. How do you stay centered?
Yeah.
Many, you know, years ago, I felt pulled in a lot of different directions.
Right.
And one of the interesting things, there was two really lessons there that were really helpful. One, when I went to the Federal Transit Administration, I went as a political appointee. Okay, there are two very different groups of people in Washington: the career for the federal government and political appointees, which come with an administration, which means you know when you are out of a job. So you kind of, you know, it's pretty clear. You have 4 years. If you're lucky, maybe more, and we won't guarantee you that. And it
Right.
quickly changed your perspective, like, okay, what can I do now, right? So that sense of focus, of time, you're just saying, I have to make choices and priorities of what I'm going to focus on in this time frame, was a very helpful exercise to get away from the I'm responsible for everything all at one
Right.
time, because then you just can't function. So that's one thing. But the second was really getting around, and I think it was a lot of the work that I did at FTA. It was very equity centric. I led a complete top to bottom rebuilding of Title VI. Our whole, you know, Department of Civil Rights, you know, went on, again, a top to bottom review while I was there. Federal Transit was the first agency to actually operationalize environmental justice as, you know, an administrative process and procedure. And that led me around the country. And, you know, I was having public meetings in Detroit at the height of the recession. Yeah, that was rough.
Yeah.
And when you go through that, it also centers you back to, at the end of the day, if you focus on what it takes to make people's lives better, that's the centering part. You know, you build everything else around it. And I'm not saying that's easy at all, because there's a lot of other things that can pull at that. But that's what I hope to, you know, bring forward as, you know, a focal point. One of the things I did at LA Metro was develop an equity platform, which was a way of thinking of equity in every line of LA Metro business, from operations to planning to project development, the whole thing. And it was welcome. And once you kind of set out a framework of just how to think about how we treat each other in terms of the work that we do, it helps. It doesn't make it necessarily easier, but it makes things more clear often when you're faced with choices.
Well, let me end the conversation today. We have a lot of students in the audience. And so I'll ask you, you know, what is the advice you would give to our students who are aspiring to be leaders in complex organizations? What advice would you give them today, given your experience?
I think you actually said it, or Dean Heller did. No matter where you end up, whether you're in the public sector, in the private sector, or philanthropy, be a partner to solve the problems we see. Co-own the problems and the solutions.
Yep.
if we can do that, then that's what we can do to advance. I think too often partnerships are of convenience, right? Well, I have time now, or I've got money now, or I've got interest now. The problems are so big and in our face, we don't have the luxury of choosing to involve ourselves as a matter of convenience. It's a matter of need. And I think if all of you, particularly you younger folks that will, and I have two of my young leaders here with me from MTC, you know, maybe this current generation, myself included, didn't leave you all the best to work with. Sorry. But that said,
Somebody really
we
laughing
tried.
over here.
But that said, work with us on the foundations that we did give you to build on. And hopefully I would love in my space here for as long as I have it to be a partner in that exercise.
Therese McMillan, thank you so much for this conversation today. Thank you. Well done.
Thanks.
All right, everybody, thank you so much. And thank you, Therese and Liz. What an inspiring conversation. Make time for work that matters. Co-own the partnership. Some great lessons, and that really tees us up for our next panel. But before we do that, we invite you to network, take a break. I've been told we have popcorn and coffee out back. And before we start up again, we're going to have a pitch from a company who's doing some creative stuff in that arena from Landed. And we have Kelly from Landed that's going to give us a talk just about 1:35. So take a break. We're going to have a little pitch at 1:35, and then we'll hear from our next panel that's focused on cross-sector partnerships. If we can find our way back to our chairs. One of the things you'll notice here is in setting up our next block of speakers, we have another little poll for you. Do you think it's important that your financial investments provide some type of social return? So we'll keep that available for you if you want to respond. But one of the things we want to do is really talk about innovation and who's innovating in this space. And so with that, I want to introduce Kelly Nayojihi from Landed. And I've mispronounced your name again. And Kelly is going to talk a little bit about what they are doing to innovate for good.
Hi. You just handed me this? We're not a tech company. I'm not a tech. Okay. Hi. My name is Kelly Nayojihi, and I am employee number 10 for San Francisco-based startup Landed. So Landed helps educators buy homes in expensive communities. We started our company in 2015. Our founders come from a range of backgrounds. There's 3 of them, and we have one founder who has a Canadian background, and so he brings a nice, fresh lens to some of the challenges that we're dealing with here. We have another founder who has parents who are educators, so grew up firsthand understanding the challenges that teachers experience, public school teachers. And our third founder is Jesse, and he has a legal background, and so he also brings, so the combination of their backgrounds really helps make for a really fresh and exciting organization. So the way that our work, and then by the way, all of the photos are actual teachers that we have helped purchase homes in the Bay Area since we started our company. So we partnered with foundations like Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Santa Cruz Community Foundation, the Zoma Foundation, and what they've done is allowed us to pool some funds to support the down payment assistance, which I'll talk about briefly. With this fund, we've been able to work with over 70 school districts here in the Bay Area, in Southern California, Seattle, and Denver. So we help people buy homes, and we do that through, our primary vehicle is through our down payment assistance. So again, these are real home buyers. And I mentioned this, we launched in the Bay Area in the fall of 2016, in Southern California in 2018, Denver, Seattle. In 2019, we're going to Honolulu. I'm very excited about that. Also Austin, Portland, Boston, and Washington, D.C. And I think that we all understand the challenges in most of these cities is the same. Home prices are extremely high, and educator income is not. And so we are a bit of a bridge to help a certain demographic, certain folks be able to buy homes in these communities where they're serving. We've been able to help 152 educators purchase homes through the down payment assistance. Thank you. And we've also been able to reach an additional 400 to 500 educators through our financial wellness programming. What we discovered was that a fair number of educators would come to us and they weren't in a position to even to have the 10% down that is a part of our program. So the innovation within our organization, which I really appreciated, was, that's a lot of people who we can't help, but what can we do to help them? So we actually launched our financial coaching this year. I went through the process of becoming a certified financial coach, so people actually get to talk to me for 30 minutes. I help them set financial goals. I help them create budgets and figure out spending plans so that they can buy with Landed or not, just to improve their financial condition. Okay, so here's how our down payment support works. Oh, no, that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about, as I mentioned, we have our down payment support. We can do up to 10%, and we have the financial coaching. Sometimes people come to us, they don't want to buy with Landed, they don't want to use the down payment assistance, so we will connect them with a group of lenders or a group of agents who can still support support them on their journey. Okay. I'm going the wrong way? All right, so here's how the down payment assistance works. So let's talk about a fictitious $500,000 home somewhere, somewhere. Right, it's a studio, right? So our goal is to put our educators in traditional funding programs. So they'll bring 10%. We'll match their 10% so they can put down 20% and have a mortgage that's 80% of the home value. Maybe like Denver is where you might find this. Actually, even under 500 in Denver. All right. So the power of the 20% down, of course, is that you're going to have a smaller mortgage. You don't have to pay the PMI insurance. And interestingly enough, when you have these competitive situations, we've had a lot of landed home buyers who are able to win not because their price was the best, but because they had a great story and because of their support with Landed. So that's actually been really rewarding to see that their offers be more competitive in more ways than one. All right, so it's a shared investment. There's no monthly payments, and it's not a loan. They're not paying each month, so it doesn't change what they're paying each month. The way that it works is that in the future, they either sell the home, they might refinance, they might decide to buy Landed out, or they just wait till the end of the 30 years. And at that point, Landed will share in the appreciation, so they would return to us their initial investment plus 25% of the appreciation. And if the home value goes down, we would deduct 25% of the depreciation from that initial investment as well. So it's really, we're sharing alongside with them. All right, and the home buyer decides when to exit the partnership. And then repay the Landed fund, and then we're able to fund other home buyers and other educators who come through and are interested in making a purchase. All right, so we also have a Landed agent network, and they are vetted, they're high performing, and they really work closely. They're really great at helping people find homes that work for them, and they can wiggle into some interesting places, and it's just amazing and fascinating. Every educator always says, I never thought this was going to work. So this is more of our home buyers. Again, we've worked with 150 folks, 152, and we've reached 300 to 400 folks at our special events. This is one of the quotes from our buyers that Landed provided a ton of support and made the process feel less intimidating. We actually hold their hand throughout the entire process. Our customer team works really closely and walks you through, and again, the education piece is really important. People first is one of the values internally as well as externally, so it's really just an amazing place to work, particularly watching home buyers have things happen that they really did not think could happen. And then internally, when we were able to say, what can we do? And then being able to say, hey, I want to do financial coaching, and having that be something of value to our customers. And the other benefits where there's no fees. The partner real estate agents actually share they gave us a referral fee, so that's where our income comes from. And we have participating lenders, and then we do extensive home buying education as well. And that's me. We also have some resources. We do events. We were in Denver last month. We were in Redondo Beach on Tuesday. We do like wellness fairs where we invite people to come and learn about the home buying journey, and that's where we're really able to reach a lot of folks. So you can find us at landed.com, Instagram and Twitter at Landed Homes, and that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. All right. So Kelly's going to be around, but we're going to keep rolling. I think it's just really interesting to look at innovators in this space of social capital and how we build community in ways that harness markets. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel. If I could have Nick Hodges come up, who will be moderating our panel. And I'm going to let you, Nick, introduce your own speakers, who are our illustrious speakers for a panel that's focused on philanthropy and this idea of community and cross-sector partnerships.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for allowing us to be here. My name's Nick Hodges, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. We are a global consulting firm, and I am also a proud USF alum. And I have the great pleasure of moderating a panel of experts in the field of philanthropy, nonprofit, and impact investing to talk about innovation in this space, and in particularly how public and private can meet together to find great solutions. So I'd like to bring Kim Wright-Vielich to the stage. Kim is the co-founder and managing director of Tideline, also a global consulting firm focused on helping clients realize both financial and societal value. And she was formerly the CEO of the Schwab Charitable Fund, where I was privileged to work with her, and grew it from a startup to one of the largest donor-advised funds in the world. I would also like to bring to the stage a good colleague and friend, Daryl Collins, who is Managing Director and CFO of Bankable Frontiers. Dr. Collins is co-author of Portfolios of the Poor, deeply knowledgeable on financial behaviors of the poor, and works globally, primarily in emerging markets, with banks and financial institutions on how to be inclusive and build products that serve the poor. I would also like to ask a new friend, Maya Perkins, to the stage. She is head of strategic initiatives at Facebook, focused on transportation, housing, and economic development. And prior to Facebook, she was executive director of Bay Area Forward, a funder collaborative in Silicon Valley fostering inclusive communities. And lastly, another new friend, Maurice Jones, the president and CEO of LISC. And prior to LISC, Maurice was also Secretary of Commerce for his home state of Virginia, and also served as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Housing and Urban Development. So please give a round of applause for our panelists. So I wanted to start us off by perhaps each one of you speaking about your own experiences and how they relate to Innovate for Good. I think philanthropy has a dual reputation of doing good, but it also doesn't have a reputation for being innovative when in fact it's a highly innovative space with its own ivory tower. I think Therese called it cylinders of excellence. I will never forget that. But we work deeply in forging partnerships that actually bring private-public and philanthropy together to solve solutions. And every person on this panel has a unique perspective around that. Perhaps, Maurice, if we could start with you and talk about some of your experiences. And once we do that, we will have a few questions and then open it up for discussion.
So you want me to start personally or with LISC?
Both.
Well, let me quickly on it. First of all, nice to be with you all, and thank you for having me. So good afternoon. Look, on a personal level, philanthropy has changed my life. I was born in a little town of 1,200 people in a little place called Kenbridge, Virginia. Who knows what Kenbridge is? You know what Kenbridge is? Boy, I got to check this guy out. I was a tobacco farmer for the first 25 years of my life. I was raised by grandparents. My grandfather went to school for 6 years in a barn. My grandmother went to school for 11 years at the colored technical school in town. They could not go further because of their race, pure and simple. Yet when I came along, I got a full scholarship to a local college that changed my life. That was philanthropy. That was philanthropy. So philanthropy, for me, without it, I certainly wouldn't be sitting here in front of you. And there are other stories to tell, but I know personally that philanthropy can change a life, because it certainly changed mine. So my hat's off to philanthropy. I work for an organization that's been around for 40 years, LISC, and we are a development finance organization. We provide access to capital to low and moderate income areas all over the country to build affordable housing, to build recreation facilities for youth, healthcare centers, workforce development. It's small business lending. It's comprehensive community development. We have a huge partnership here with Facebook. We have a huge partnership with the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and some others around trying to address this incredible issue you have here around affordable housing. Well, we've invested $60 billion in the projects that we've worked on in the 40 years. 60% of that has come from philanthropy. I'll talk to you more about that, but we know that without philanthropy, this country, with all of our imperfections, would be much more imperfect. The question is how you continue to utilize philanthropy in the 21st century to stay relevant. And hopefully we can talk about that this afternoon. So those would be my experiences. Hopefully that's helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Good
Maya.
afternoon.
Hi. So I will also start with the personal. And philanthropy has also been really instrumental in my life. I grew up in East Palo Alto, California, and mostly went to private schools. And my family was able to afford them, one through scholarships, and then also through like friends. We had a neighbor of ours in East Palo Alto who was an older woman, and she just seemed so old. And now I realize she was probably about 60. It's not old. But she would help us help my parents pay our school fees, our tuition. And so my dad was a community college professor. My mom was a local community activist and community builder. And even with the scholarship, it was hard to afford our private schools. And so this older woman helped us go to school. And that has been my experience throughout my education of being able to have assistance. So I'm very grateful for that. Now I work at Facebook, and so many folks have thought, oh, that's so different. And I'm like, yeah, it's different because it's on a huge scale of wonderful things we can do, which has been pretty amazing to be able to work for a corporation who is really committed to collaboration and social good and social mobility. And so I work on a team that is very focused on social mobility. And as Maurice said, Facebook has partnered with LISC and others to advance housing in the region and really help improve the lives of a lot of people so that they can have stories like many of us of coming from families that maybe couldn't afford a lot of things, and but now are in stable jobs and able to live in stability and have the opportunity to give back.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm Daryl Collins, and I have managed and grown a global consulting company, for-profit consulting company. But stretching a bit further back, how did I get into sort of the realm of what we would call social business? And once upon a time, I was working on Wall Street and decided to I was working on emerging markets. I decided to go to South Africa and become a portfolio manager. And while I was in South Africa, I decided that working on the portfolios of the rich was actually really boring. And so, to be honest, and I decided to focus on the portfolios of the poor and did a research study around South Africa, tracking exactly how the low-income households manage their money, every cash flow in, every expenditure out. But then all the informal financial instruments they used, all the trying to hold money back, all the savings groups that they participated in. And I wrote a book called, literally, Portfolios of the Poor. And that's been my baseline ever since. Now, BFA focuses on financial inclusion in emerging markets purely. I've helped run this financial diaries study in the US. You might be aware of Financial Diaries, a book called Financial Diaries, by Jonathan Murdoch and Rachel Snyder of CFSI. And interestingly, what they found, and with some assistance from BFA, is that, low-income people in the US, actually, there aren't a lot of differences in how they manage their money compared to people in Mexico, Kenya, and India. There's a lot of similarities. What we do as BFA is we work in partnership with a number of donors. Our clients are donors, and with the help of our PA, we often manage big projects, multi-year, multi-million dollars, and we work with financial institutions of different types. We've worked with big, huge banks, like Standard Bank in South Africa or ICICI in India. And we help to, in that situation, encourage them to offer savings products to low-income people. We've worked with microfinance institutions to help build their skills to better offer financial products to low-income people. And we worked with startups across the globe who would be focused on financial inclusion of some type to help them get going and get to the next stage of their evolution. So let me stop there and hand.
Thank you.
I'm Kim Wright-Village, and I thank you all for having us as well. I want to commend USF for organizing an event around this topic. It's incredibly timely. If you're in the field, you know that the Global Impact Investors Network just published their estimate of the impact investing market. And just to be clear, impact investing is not screens. It's not taking out the quote-unquote sin stocks. It's not necessarily taking into account environmental, social, and governance factors in doing your due diligence on your investments. It's actually investments that are aimed at catalyzing or driving social or environmental change. And that market is now estimated at about $500 billion. And if you think about that in the context of philanthropy, which is about $800 billion in private foundations in this country, that's a very significant market. And today, it's an estimated that 24% of all public invested assets are screened in some way. Let that settle in. There should be two responses to that. One, it's huge, and two, is it authentic? Right? So I got into this industry, so to speak, if you want to call it an industry, because I had been in conventional markets and in financial services and had taken some time off to be with my children. And when I went back, I said, I want to have the sense of urgency and accountability of the private sector and the mission-driven aspects of the social sector. And I went looking for a job that created that, and Schwab was launching their donor advised fund, and that's where I landed. And then over the course of building that with Nick, we got to about $5 billion in contributed assets, and we were granting a lot. Donor advised funds grant a lot more than foundations. They grant between 20 and 25%. But you still have these assets waiting to be granted. And we were trying to figure out ways to deploy the assets while they were waiting to be granted. And so we launched the first in a donor advised fund guarantee fund, which when we get to the blended finance part of our dialogue, we can talk a little bit about that. But that experience, the experience of growing a donor advised fund, which is nothing more than a financial services product oriented on philanthropy, gave me a view into the power of the private markets and how fast they can scale and how quickly they can move things. Because you can't build a nonprofit to $5, $10 billion, $20 billion in a decade normally. So that really began my shift to impact investing. And then I tried to teach it at Haas Business School for 2 semesters. Where it was one of those situations where you're reading one chapter ahead of your MBA students. And I would be a much better professor today than I was then. And then I launched a Tideline. And if you want to remember Tideline's name, think of it as the line between the social returns and financial returns. And Tideline's a strategy consulting firm, sort of like a McKinsey, but focused almost exclusively on impact investing. And we advise big institutional investors like the Gates Foundation, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. We've advised 30% of the largest foundations in the country. We also advise CDFIs. I'll be bending Maurice's arm afterwards. And we advise large institutions that are trying to figure this out. The Fidelities, Franklin Templetons, UBSs, Morgan Stanleys. And they're looking at what's happening. They're looking at the surveys of people that are interested in doing this and saying, how do we respond to this? What's in our portfolio? How do we do it with some authenticity? And they may be motivated by their brand protection rather than the impact, but they don't want to be caught being inauthentic and have it hurt them. So as a consequence, that creates a lot of work for us.
Thank you. I wanted to start with one question that we've spoken about, and Kim alluded to blended finance. We've spoken about the money that philanthropy funds and generates, but it's a microdot of the private markets, right? So, what is the role of philanthropy in spurring private investment? When we looked at when the SDGs were launched and they estimated what it would take to fund the SDGs, it runs over $4 trillion annually. So government philanthropy could never do that. It has to be unlocked in the private markets. But philanthropy can play a very interesting role going in first, right? To play a role of a loss leader, or to build infrastructure, or to spur competition that will actually bring funding to the space. So what I'd like to ask the panel is, as we've become more complex and more creative, what do we think the role of blended capital is playing in an ever more evolving ecosystem? Each one of you represents a different perspective in the space. Would love to understand if you have an example of where it's making a difference, or from a different perspective, talk about what you think the needs are in order for these collaborations to be effective. If anyone has a first word, great.
I'll start off. Blended capital is really the primary way that we're going to truly achieve social innovation at scale. So let me give you an example. We here in the Bay Area are in the midst now of putting together a $500 million loan fund for housing for people who are from 30% of area median income up to 150%. I joke all the time, $500 million in the Bay Area gets you 2 units of housing, but but that's aside. That is a joke. That is a joke. You can laugh. You can laugh. Okay, 3 to be generous. To serve that spectrum of income earners, you have to be able to have products that are competitively or below market enough to make the economics work to develop the housing or to preserve the housing or to protect the housing, which means you need a capital stack. You need a stack that has at its base philanthropic dollars. Those philanthropic dollars may be the dollars that you need to serve as the loan loss reserve for the loans that you're going to be providing to developers to preserve or to produce. Those philanthropic dollars may be the dollars that you need in order to actually develop the right products for certain segments of the population. Those philanthropic dollars are the dollars that you need in order to blend the interest rate low enough to serve a segment of the market that's not already been served. You cannot do this without philanthropic dollars. You cannot do it with just market-based dollars or loan dollars from traditional financial institutions. Otherwise, we wouldn't be where we are now. It would already make sense. And so what you find in funds that you need to do work that brings both a social return and a financial return, you need a layer of philanthropic dollars. We always say that you need 20% at least of the capital stack for social good work to be 0% interest, namely philanthropic, in order for the stack to work. You need dollars that are willing to take risk, that are willing to mitigate other risk in order to attract the private sector in. I could go on, but you get the point. So that $500 million fund that we're doing here in the Bay Area would not have been possible but for Chan Zuckerberg stepping up and offering a $40 million grant. That was the seed that brought everybody else to the table. That $40 million grant now is the loan loss reserve for everybody else that's putting in debt capital. We have 100+ examples like that all around the country. We put together a fund that is designed to do mixed income or mixed use development, largely along transit lines. And what we were aiming for was along transit lines to build supportive housing, permanent supportive housing for homeless, healthcare centers, and commercial real estate, all in the same facility along a transit line. To do it, to make it work, we had to get philanthropic capital, we had to use tax credits, and we had to get debt. The first place, though, where we had to go first in order to attract all the rest was the philanthropic capital. So it is hard to overstate how important it is to have, first of all, a blended stack of capital to do the kind of work that we're talking about in order to produce social and financial return. It is also hard to overstate how important it is for that philanthropic capital to be the first in. When it's the first in, they will come.
I also think an important piece to add on to what Maurice said is the blended capital is vital, and so are the blended voices. And so when you look at philanthropy, they are going to come with a voice. And that voice can be the catalyst to bring in others. But each sector at the table is going to have its own input and its own layer. And so when bringing together a fund or a partnership or a collaboration, it's important to honor and listen to each of the voices and understand that each entity is going to have a certain need and need to get a certain type of return. At Facebook, we have really, as I mentioned, focused on social mobility. And so that is a huge part of what we do, and housing is a really big piece of that. And so we want to be a part of something that has a broad AMI, so that people can come in at various levels of, the housing ladder or the social mobility ladder, and that it's broad enough that it really responds to the needs of our region. And right now, the housing crisis that we're dealing with is so broad that it takes a lot of partners and a range of AMI levels to actually impact the crisis. And each partner needs to be able to get what they want out of it. And I think being able to invite the collaboration to the table in a way that is open and that assumes good intent is really vital. That is a sort of like a cultural saying at Facebook, assume good intent. And I think that when you're bringing in people from a lot of different places, it's a great place to start.
Yes. You know why I want to go next? Is because I'm going to be the voice of doom. And I want you to bring us back up. So
That's a lot of responsibility. Go ahead.
So I'm sitting here listening to Maurice, and I'm getting more and more depressed because it sounds like it works. It does work. And most things in international development, I gotta say, it doesn't work. You gotta be ready to just blow money and know that it's not going to work. You remind me so much of the structures that people try to put around agriculture, for example, or agricultural lending, and the field of international development is just littered with stuff that doesn't work, which doesn't help the stuff that does work to flourish, really. You got to have something of a rising of the phoenix. So, and it's so scattered. So let me think about things that have worked. Here's a really good example in financial inclusion. Totally private effort from Safaricom in Kenya, who introduced M-Pesa, which is a phone-to-phone way of transferring money. Now, Tavneet Suri and Billy Jack from MIT and Georgetown came out with a study that said, wow, this little bloody, money transfer service helps people get out of poverty. A teeny, tiny number of very, 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 very poor Kenyans. Nonetheless, it actually made a difference. That was pure corporate, no philanthropy. Pure government, the Aadhaar system in India, which gave everybody a digital ID, and then it's kind of opened up a whole bunch of financial changes. There are pros and cons with Aadhaar and digital ID and the government being so muscular, but pure government. Not a lot of social funding. One of the challenges is that you're talking about places with weak states. So, and the rule of law is a little iffy. So if you're talking about trying to enforce contracts, it's really difficult. So doing some sort of, guaranteed interest rate or guaranteed payment or what have you, it's really difficult. From the top down, from this philanthropic plus, the blended finance approach. What we've tried to do in my company with donors is equally scattered. So, for example, when we worked with large financial institutions to help prompt them to focus on the bottom of the pyramid of their market, so to speak, that was a $10 million project from the Gates Foundation. It was a couple of years ago. It was pretty experimental. The whole crux of that project was, these are large banks. These are large publicly listed banks. They're very wealthy, right? They serve corporates, they've got plenty of money. But the grants and the technical assistance was supposed to crowd in sort of a greater dedication to the bottom of the pyramid. They didn't care about the money. Those who were a bit more successful cared about the prestige of being attached to something that the Gates Foundation was supporting and that big banks around the world were about. And the people who were most successful were the ones who just made it into a total corporate spin to make sure that they could secure something like marketing dollars. But I must say, when I look back on that project, $10 million out the window, in my opinion, because now, of those 5 banks, only one continues to have a financial inclusion department. Those are market dynamics. We had better luck with smaller cooperatives and microfinance institutions who are not made of money. They're still profitable, because that's the name of the game, because they have to be sustainable. But they desperately needed that technical assistance. Again, it really wasn't so much about the money. It was about the pure learning between them. It was about focusing the mind. I like to say it was partially about us and the technical assistance, but we found that with that institution, we could move much further, much faster. Nowadays, there's much more of an emphasis on impact investing in startups across, the global South. And we run a fund through RPA, which is a TA fund, not an investment fund, where impact investors put forward companies that they're interested in, and they're not yet ready even for seed funding, and we try to take them to the next level. Now, the CEOs of these companies really tend to like what we do for them, but we kind of wonder how much it's really impacting the poor versus something that's a really cool idea. I think the biggest thing, it's not about the money, although these guys really need the funds. I think what really moves the needle is having somebody from the impact fund sitting on that board and keeping their nose to the grindstone in terms of their mission. I had someone from Women's World Banking who's an NGO, focuses on women's financial inclusion globally, and they do have an impact fund. And she recently said to me, she's like, man, I think the biggest impact that we have is when we have our investment advisors sit on the boards. And that's where we have impact. And I thought that was a pretty interesting observation. So let me stop there. Maybe not quite so gloomy, but Kim's going to be a lot less gloomy.
Oh, yeah, she puts the pressure on me. And then I think Maurice is probably chomping at the bit to be able to articulate that it works. So I want to, on Tideline's website, we just published a piece in less than a month ago, I think, called Catalytic Capital. And it was funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and it's all about this topic. It's about how do you use philanthropy in the capital stack or to catalyze private sector investment. What are the things that it does? And Maurice touched on some of them, but one of the things that he did not touch on that sort of addresses what Daryl was talking about, which is accountability. Philanthropy can play a role in accountability. They can play a role in creating transparency, which is connected with accountability. And then the paper also touches on the risks of crowding out distorting a market, crowding out conventional investments. After the horrific Great Recession that we had in 2008 and 2009, I remember somebody articulating the theory that the CDFI and the CRA legislation was the source of this, which is just absolutely absurd. But it did give, for a short period of time before the real scholarship kicked in, a scapegoat for what was happening on Wall Street. The point is that all philanthropy has unintended consequences occasionally. Philanthropy often fails, but not any more than venture capital, which is if you get 2 out of 10, you're thrilled. And when people say to me, capital stacked money or guaranteed money or concessionary money or catalytic money from philanthropy distorts the market because they become dependent on this cheap capital. I don't know how long it's going to take Tesla to be profitable. Right. But I can tell you it would be very unusual for a social enterprise to last 12 years without profitability. So I do think you have to be aware of these distortions, and they're going to be unintended consequences, and there's no question that there's going to be failures. But there is an incredibly effective role for philanthropy around transparency and accountability to try and address some of this. Was that optimistic enough?
Better. Definitely.
Well, and I want to add, there's a number of questions that we've got, and we've only got time for one, so I'm trying to sort of create a theme with it. But for some context, you know, one of the West's most significant exports before the 20th century was colonialism. So we built and invested in structures that purposely leave people out. And now philanthropic and private capital is going in to sometimes mitigate or fix those systems, and in some cases coming in and building new systems. It's fraught with risk. An impact investor who's doing real impact investing has to have a risk profile of a venture capitalist, right? It is, and because you're adding the complexity of also measuring social return. But looking at those complexities and looking at the different roles that come in, I would really appreciate some perspectives on how we, with our different perspectives, manage those risks to get a successful outcome.
Let me make sure I'm with you.
Yeah.
Manage risk.
Sorry, looking at the risk of not doing good.
Oh.
And adding the complexity of having different types of funders working together.
Yes.
What you might need from your perspective to make it a successful collaborative?
Yes. Okay. So we're in an academic setting. I think it was Yeats who wrote a poem in the 50s, Choruses from the Rock. And I'm going to get there, I promise. He's lamenting that he thinks people are turning away from God in the church. But he has this line, or a couple of lines, where he says that he's talking about us. He says, when they try to escape the real world, they go dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will ever need to be good. In this country, we have a system that at one and the same time is producing the lowest unemployment rate that we've had since 1969, and in 9,000 plus census tracts, an unemployment rate that's over 15%. In this country, we have this incredible, we're sitting in one now, we have this incredible higher education system that helps people completely transform their lives, while people who are coming out of prison are fighting to find a way to get employed. In this country, right here, if you drive 10 minutes in a circle, you will pass through census tracts that have a 69-year life expectancy and an 86-year life expectancy. We have a system that none of us can dream. Afford to a dream is so perfect that you don't need to do good. That's where philanthropy comes in. We need people who want to do good, to work alongside everybody else. If you don't have that in all the work we're trying to do, we're going to fall short of what this experiment called America is aspiring to be. We need people who just want to do good, period. That's where philanthropy comes in. Can we enable and put vehicles around to make sure that the philanthropic seeker and the market seeker and the below market seeker can work together? Absolutely. We do it every day. We do it every day. And in fact, that market seeker is happy that that below market seeker is in there, right? That's almost like a guarantee. What we have to do is to make sure that we set up structures for these different, arguably different motivated or complicated in their motivations actors are at the table, are helping to make the decisions, are feeling empowered and understand where they're coming from. But that's not the hard piece. That's not the hard piece at all. The real hard piece is finding more and more folks who want to go to those places that I just described and who want to stay there long enough to make a difference. It's the patience that we are missing the most. And so what I think helps people actually endure or helps us create the stamina that we're going to need to work in these communities where perhaps 50% of the population are reentering is patient capital and a high-functioning team around it. You got to have philanthropy for that. So come join the party. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
And I would say that listening to the voices of the people in the community, and I think that that helps address the issue of colonialism. And so we at Facebook are very informed by our community members. We talk to community members, we talk to the activists, we talk to folks with lived experience. A lot of the lived experience folks are also on our team. And so it's a matter of listening to what people need and then co-creating something together. And so our teacher housing program was in response to the needs of teachers. Our housing fund for a significant amount that's going to people with an AMI of 30% and below, that was co-created with community members. The Partnership for the Bay's Future, that was co-created with community members. And so all of these things, it's not a we will help you and tell you what you need. It is tell us what you need, how can we do it together? And a lot of these things are actually in our corporate interests because our employees, a lot of them cannot afford to live close to campus. And a lot of our employees want to live in diverse neighborhoods, and they don't want to feel as if they are somehow causing discomfort or problems for their neighbors. So it is a shared interest. I think of philanthropy, I know of Facebook and corporations, to work with people and to also, as was said, take that risk. And I guess I don't see it as like a huge failure. And so if we do something and people say, look, we want this, and we're like, okay, let's create it, and we create it, and we're like, whoa, that didn't work. Well, but we learned something, and then we go on to the next thing, and we're like, well, what is gonna work? But I think as long as it's a collaboration, we're in a really, really good space to make positive change.
Thank you.
I think I forget the question. Risk. Here's the, I mean, I have mentioned that I feel, so private companies in developing markets, and especially in financial inclusion, because remember, this is banks and lenders and payment companies, and, you know, they're by nature for-profit companies. A lot of the change is really coming from private industry in low-income markets. Now, how do you get... So I want to notice that. And I want to notice also that the income disparity in a lot of developing countries is massive, which means that there are a lot of rich people right at the top of the pyramid. One of the most interesting notions that I think is coming about in my industry is how do you crowd in that local capital? And that sort of local people who have gotten very wealthy on sort of the way that these markets are formed, how do you crowd that in? How do you keep it from just simply going into U.S. stocks? Because there is an interest in building up the country. There is a sense of nationalism. But one of the challenges is if they take a chance and they provide some funding to one of these private companies that happens to be a startup that is going to work and serve the large corporations, there's very little chance of an exit, right? There's almost no chance of an IPO, and there's only so many companies in that small market that you could sell to as an exit. And so one of the things that the CDC, which is fully funded by the UK government, it's an impact investor, one of the things that they've become interested in is how do we get that local capital under some sort of, we take a stake in some sort of instrument that can pull in and crowd in that local capital. Do we then develop capital markets that make it easier to get out of that investment? So in other words, they're working at the beginning of the funding of the company, but they're also working at the end and trying to crowd in the wealthy money that is in Nigeria and Kenya and India and Brazil. And I think that that's a very, very interesting notion. And that's yet another place where philanthropy, if it can just simply go first with the wealthy individuals, that may be a very tractable moment. And then the other thing, to Kim's point, is just simply the tracking of, does this make a difference? Yep. Which I think is important. Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Okay, I guess I'm going to say something about risks. Now I'll just say two quick things. One is these issues are incredibly complex. They're more complex than traditional investing. They're more complex than creating wealth. And it's very, very hard to create wealth. It's very hard to make a company successful under the best circumstances. And I'll just give two quick anecdotes to capture the complexity. The UN Educational Commission is trying to create a facility to fund international education in the developing world. They're trying to get donor countries to provide guarantees or cheaper debt through the World Bank and other facilities. And if they provide cheaper debt to the developing countries, they'll theoretically increase their educational spending. But that sounds pretty straightforward. It's not even begin to be straightforward, because if you're a developing world, any government, wherever you are on the planet, and somebody's giving you cheap capital to do one thing, the money that you would have spent on that, you go spend on something else. So how do you make sure that the pie that's going to education actually increases? Two, the quality of education that's being delivered in the developing world is so subpar that kids get out of secondary school and they're not employable, they can't read, they can't do math. So how do you make sure that increasing the budget really results in increased learning? So these are just incredibly complex issues. And in terms of Daryl's comment about local money crowding in developing markets, a lot of markets have regulation against their pension funds investing in their own markets. And part of that is currency risk, right? Which is a reasonable risk to manage to, but there's sometimes regulatory obstacles to these things. Anyway, the point is that it takes people like you that care about it, that want to invest the time and the rigor and the intellectual horsepower in thinking about it in nuanced ways and in not superficial ways. That's what will get you there. Complex problems require complex solutions. They're bound to be errors. You have to be patient. You have to stay for the long haul, and you have to tolerate, and you really have to be rigorous and nuanced in your thinking about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all, and we'll bring Billy back to the stage.
Give him a big round of applause. And we should thank Nick. I didn't do a great job introducing Nick, that he COO of Rockefeller Philanthropies, and actually, I believe the inaugural COO of Schwab Charitable here in the city. So let's give Nick a hand as well. So thank you, panelists. To cite some more Yeats, turning the widening gyre, things fall apart. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Wicked problems. And so we heard a little bit about some of what Mel Weber talked about, wicked problems and some of the solutions. We're going to scratch the surface a little more on some of these. In the spirit of some interaction, I've got another poll question for you to respond to. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and I'm going to strict on that 10-minute break. Don't get too social, because you're going to come back here and you do not want to miss an interesting talk from Regina Clola from Populus. So come back, take some time, but come back really quick. No, I'll invite you up. I'll invite you up. All right, folks, let's find those seats. Hey, party's not over. So I'm glad to see so much energy, but we've got a little talk here, and then we're going to roll into our next little session. It needs to be. Yeah. Okay, find your seats. So I'd like to, we have a little pitch here from Regina Clulo, and Regina founded Populus about a year ago. Before that, she worked for a number of Bay Area transportation companies. So a number similar to Therese, grappling with one of these wicked problems our region has. PhD from MIT, but also spent some time at Berkeley and got her bachelor's degree from Cornell. So without further ado, Regina.
The award is on your seat to give.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much, Billy. So I have an interesting background as an entrepreneur. I've actually spent most of my life working at nonprofits and for public sector agencies and in academia. And I moved back out to the Bay Area. I'm originally a Bay Area native to work on transportation problems. I did my PhD at MIT in transportation planning. And then when I moved back out here, my role was to help the Bay Area Regional Planning Agency forecast the next 30 years of travel. And at that time, there was this little new service that had arrived, Uber and Lyft, and a lot of public agencies weren't really taking them very seriously. My theory is that Uber had just transitioned from Uber Cab and a private black car service into something that was a little bit different. But more so, Lyft had the absurd pink mustaches. And so when I was running around talking to public agencies while I was working on this MTC Bay Area forecast for the future of travel, most public agencies didn't really react to how those new services were changing people's transportation patterns. Fast forward another 7 years, and we've seen a continued evolution of mobility services that have arrived in cities, and really very little information about how those services are being used and whether or not they're helping to meet public goals and how. And one of the big challenges is that without communication systems, coordination, and data between the public sector and the private sector and vice versa, many of these private mobility services are going to fail to deliver on their promises to cities to deliver and improve better transportation services. It's actually very similar to the very early days of commercial aviation. Private mobility services back then were moving faster than the public sector could manage, and we didn't actually create the FAA until planes were literally hitting each other and falling out of the sky. And so what we're building at Populus is a platform that helps cities understand how new mobility services are being used in their cities, to better coordinate with those operators, to design and identify pickup and drop-off areas so they can optimize traffic flow, to dynamically price public space so that we can use it more efficiently and help achieve environmental goals, and then to also harness that data for short and long-range transportation planning. This is an example of one of our customers. The County of Arlington in the DC area is using our platform to understand where scooters and bikes are being placed in the county and where they're being used so they can design better infrastructure. And I think one of the really exciting things about micromobility services is that they've offered this new opportunity for cities to justify reclaiming streets to move more pedestrians and active transportation. And it's an opportunity that it is not to be missed. I mean, cities right now across the United States and really across the world are really thinking about how we allocate public space in a way that is more efficient, more equitable, and continues to improve the safety of our streets. So Populus is a data platform that helps them achieve those goals. We have great relationships with the operators themselves as well as cities, and we're excited to help bridge the gap between private mobility innovation and how it can be used to improve urban transportation for all of us. So thank you so much. It's great to be here.
All right, we're back there talking Oakland. Yeah. All right, folks, thank you so much. Our panel back in the back is really like chattering, so we're going to invite up our next panel is really focused on some of the issues that Regina started to talk about. And you'll notice that the question we had up before, if we can cycle back to some of our previous slides, was this idea of how do we grapple with the challenges. So to start us off, I just want to invite up Molly Wood. So Molly, if you would come on up and you can maybe introduce your panel, and I'll give you a proper. So Molly, if you haven't heard of her, she makes us all smarter. So Molly does marketplace tech with American Public Media, and Sheikha is going to introduce her illustrious panel.
Absolutely. Thanks, Billy. I forgot my water.
Can we toggle to the other? Oh wait, to the other.
And we all got a water bottle. Next up, Kevin Peterson, who's CEO of Marble, which you're going to explain to us. Stephen Hardy, CEO of mySidewalk. Lenny Mendonça, Chief Economic and Business Advisor for Governor Newsom. And finally, Robert Grant, VP of Global and Government Affairs at Cruise Automation. Welcome, you guys. I'm going to start everyone off. I think this is going to be maybe a tiny bit of therapy. I'm excited that we have technology and government on the stage together because I feel that there could be some bridge building necessary. So don't worry about that, but get comfortable. What I'm going to have each of you do, actually, other than our mayor, who doesn't need to tell us that much about what you do, but if you have any little insights, we'd love to hear them. I'd like each of you to tell us a little bit about what you're working on specifically, and then answer this sort of starting question, which is the theme of this conference is Innovate for Good. So when I say for good, what comes to mind? Mayor Schaaf, I'm going to start with you. Oh, right.
I don't know, oh good, we at least have 2 mics between 5 people. So I'm the mayor of Oakland. I do everything between filling the pothole on your street, your specific street, to trying to address global warming, often in the same 5 minutes. And when I think about for good, you know, my dream for Oakland, it's my hometown, it's where I was born and raised, and I also believe that it stands for values that are much bigger than just a place on a map. I think about equity. I think about this idea that people should feel that their government makes society better and more fair. And I also think that for good means that every person should thrive. Every person should have the basic necessities, the basic human dignities, and we do have a lot of work to do.
I'm Kevin Peterson. I built some of the first self-driving cars about 10 years ago. Then I built moon landers, and then I decided to come back to Earth, and now we're doing delivery robots. And what I think about when I think about innovating for good is a few things. One is saving people time, which we think builds community. So you spend about half of your time in cars running errands. If you could have that time back, could you spend more time with your family? Could you meet your neighbors? And I think that brings humanity. The second is safety. So how do we make vehicles that improve accident rates and things like that?
Will you back up just 1 second and tell us what Marble does?
Oh, yeah.
So people know the vehicles you're talking about?
Marble builds autonomous self-driving delivery robots. So they drive on the sidewalk, they deliver from a store to your home, and they're on demand.
Hi, my name's Stephen Hardy. I'm the CEO of mySidewalk. We're a data analytics company, but we work almost exclusively with public sector customers and city planners by background largely. And I think for us, the for good part of this, I think Therese and Maurice both kind of nailed this. Improving quality of life is a big part of our mission. And what I loved about what Maurice was saying is that there's an imperative part of that. There's kind of a long-term for good. And when you're thinking about data patterns and making kind of structural changes, it's easy to kind of think about the long-term, but there's what do we do tomorrow? And so that's where we're trying to really help cities think about the operational improvements that they can make that'll help improve quality of life for residents.
Great, thank you. I'm Lenny Mendoza. As of February, I'm Governor Gavin Newsom's Chief Economic and Business Advisor, which means I oversee an agency that's called the Office of Business and Economic Development. I'm the chair of the High-Speed Rail Agency and also advise the governor on issues that are related to the economy and business more broadly. And before that, I was at McKinsey for 30 years, so I think about this in both a public and private sector standpoint. But in my current role, very similar to what the mayor said, is what I think about innovating for good is about making the California dream real for all Californians. And that's really our overarching agenda item, which is ensuring that we've got an inclusive economy that is inclusive in the sense that it works for everyone, not just the people who happen to be within a 45-minute driving distance of Sand Hill Road, but everyone, no matter where they are in the state of California, and that we grow the economy in a way that is both economically attractive and inclusive, but also much less carbon and much more attractive for the environment going forward. So that's what I think about what is it that we need to do to innovate for good from the state of California standpoint.
Great, thank you. My name is Robert Grant again. I'm here representing Cruise. At Cruise, we're building the world's most advanced self-driving vehicle. We're out on the roads here in San Francisco testing every day with 2 operators in the vehicle, really gaining a lot of understanding about how these vehicles will operate in the real world safely. We're an all-electric fleet, which we'll touch on some of the things that I think about when I think about for good. So I think mainly about 3 things, which is safety, inclusivity, and longevity. And by safety, I mean bringing safety to our roads, where over 37,000 people die each year in motor vehicle accidents, almost 3,800 of them here in California each year. We think our vehicles can make a big dent in that, and so we think that's something for good. Inclusivity, I mean bringing more people access to mobility, including those who have had traditional issues with accessing transportation options, whether that's persons with disabilities, the elderly, or other folks that might live in transit deserts. And then longevity. We want to build something that's lasting. I think it's an accomplishment to have 10 of these vehicles out there. It makes a small dent. But when you have a lot of these vehicles out there at scale and they're all electric, that can make a long-standing change with regards to carbon emissions, with regards to how people move around, and really make a lasting impact over the long haul for lots of folks.
So we don't have a ton of time, which means I have to go directly to tension. My apologies in advance. But we really do seem to be in this moment where technology has collided with civic life in a lot of different ways, whether that's elections, privacy, scooters. So you're going to get, this is coming to you, Kevin. But so I think, and by the way, I know that there are not as many microphones as people, but please feel free to have a conversation and jump in on each other here. I really wonder, I'd like to get your take on whether technology has moved too fast in California in particular. Do you feel that the boundary pushing, the innovation part, has created tension not just with policymakers, but with consumers? I'll start on the other end, Robert.
So do I think technology has moved too fast? I think it's an interesting question. I think technology evolves at a rapid rate. I think it's always evolved at a rapid rate. I think where we're seeing things now is the scale and reach and ubiquity of that technology. And we're seeing the kind of robust debate that I think needs to happen about what is the proper role of technology in daily life. who should be regulating that? What are the types of actors that should be responsible for ensuring that this is done in an appropriate and useful fashion for good, right? I think when I think of other technology platforms, they're going through a series of issues now that are both foreseen and unforeseen. I think that's part of where the friction is coming in is should they have been more forward-looking or looking at different things? When it comes to self-driving vehicles, I think it is a little bit of a different beast, only because the technology challenge behind getting these type of vehicles out there, we refer it internally at Cruise as one of the greatest engineering challenges of our lifetime. And so while we see a lot of rapid development in it, it's very difficult to get out there at the same kind of scale that raises some of the issues that are being addressed now. So for instance, we've been testing here in San Francisco for 4+ years now. We have 100 and some plus vehicles in our fleet, and people see them, but that's not the same as a Facebook, which has grown to billions of users over the same time. So I think it's different depending on the platform. But I do think these are good questions that, at least for our space, we want to address ahead of time and have made an effort to work with, whether it's at the local, state, or federal or international level to address them.
I mean, Mayor Schaaf, should Kevin call you before he puts delivery robots on the streets in Oakland? Potholes notwithstanding?
Yes. But let me just big picture kind of talk about what I hate about government and how tech could actually help me accelerate what I love about government. First of all, I think the examples that you just gave are things that should make you appreciate the regulatory role that government plays. While it might irritate all you entrepreneurs, I think we have ample examples about why it's necessary and for the greater good. But here's the thing that I hate about government. Government was actually designed to create stability and predictability. And that means that government was designed to not change quickly. And what I hate about that is that I represent an institution that has preserved barriers to opportunity, that continues to sustain institutionalized racism, and that it is not changing quickly enough. And it was, by design, intended to be that way. And so where I see kind of the exciting intersection, and yes, technology can be irritating because without regulation, it tends to serve the wealthiest. It tends to get distracted by the next shiny new thing, as opposed to actually digging deep and thinking about how it really can be for good. But when we can step out of our respective silos and experiment together, do things that I can't do within government because government was intended to be adverse to risk-taking. So when we intentionally collaborate to try things, to take risks, to do things that are much more aggressive, much more ambitious, much more visionary than government is comfortable with the intention of taking what works and then scaling it and institutionalizing it within the public systems. I believe that is the only way we will change the world with any sort of speed or scale or significance. And the world needs a lot of changing. I did not get into this job to preserve the status quo. I got into it to make the world a better place, starting with Oakland, California. But I believe that I can't do that without partnering with the private sector. And tech has been a pretty exciting, wild partner to work with.
You want to take that one, Kev? Are you calling? Sure. Did you get her number?
We're actually working with the Shared Mobility Group in Oakland right now. So I don't know if I can call you directly, but we feel the same way. I think self-driving cars and the vehicles that we build are not an app on somebody's phone. And so when you're rolling out something that it's in the public space and it's operating right next to people, you need to do that responsibly, you need to do it safely, and you need to do it in a way that provides a public good.
But I'll still get calls. Trust
me. You'll still get calls, I'm sure.
That's true. That is true.
But we have to, as technology developers, I think that we have a responsibility to show what that public good is beyond just serving the Palo Alto natives. And what we want to do is build vehicles that can, for instance, do deliveries to food deserts where people don't have access to grocery stores. And you can only do that in a way, you can only do that if that's cost effective, and that takes technological development. We have to, like you say, partner to get these vehicles out in a way that also that shows their value, which means we do have to do it incrementally at some scale, but also, on our side is responsible and does that safely. So I think it's important to have the dialogue.
There's been so much talk today about equity and affordability. And so clearly just on the safety measures and on the fact that people, across the country spend more than 20% of their income, if you're a median income person, on transportation, like those two imperatives to me say there's a lot of good to be done in the transportation sector, right? It's an imperative. So then the question is, how do you make sure that everyone benefits from it? And it is absolutely, I think, the structural systems, you look at the transportation systems of the past, and they are exactly what got us into this problem. So how do we not, fall into that trap again? And the only way I can think of doing it is exactly the way the mayor describes, as partners. The only thing that I'd say that's kind of a lesson out of that is there are over 5,000 cities above 15,000 people across the country. There are lots of places for experimentation, and there are a lot of places to learn incremental lessons that can be codified across the country. So I would just say it's also, I think, a nice way for us to be thinking about cities as microcosms for innovation, and that can happen in many places outside of where it currently is today.
Yeah, Lenny, talk to us about how that comes to the state level and how the governor's office is looking at that private-public partnership.
So to answer your question directly, technology is not moving too fast, and we certainly do not think that in the state of California, where we're the home of innovation, we're the home of venture capital, we're the home of where a lot of these ideas originate. And so the last thing we want to do is slow down innovation. But we don't begrudge the value creation that comes out of that either, if it's done in a way that is good for broader society and not about catch me if you can regulatory arbitrage, or something that is solely oriented to making a quick buck and then leaving. So what we're interested in is trying to encourage more of what is the best of the origins of venture and innovation, which is about public purpose. You're trying to solve a fundamental problem. That problem isn't just how to get wealthy. It's how to try and solve that problem. And we can help move that to something where we are incenting that kind of behavior. And so the thing that we need to do is ensure that our policy apparatus catches up with the technological innovation. And as the mayor said, we're only going to do that if we are innovating in the public sector and ensuring that we're working together, not at odds all the time, to make sure that these things really work. And I'll give you two examples where I think that's going to be important in the state of California. One has to do with the future of work. And so a lot of the innovations that we're talking about, whether it's autonomous cars, robotics more generally, artificial intelligence, even just application of mobile technology, are going to hit in California first. So we need to get way ahead of that, not to scare people that robots are going to eat your jobs, but to understand how we adapt to that environment so as that technology develops, we have a population that can benefit from that. More concretely, in the near term, I think we're having and will have a serious conversation with the digital platforms around where does the dividend from digital benefit go? Is it just to shareholders, or do you own your data? How do we think about the value of your privacy? How do we think about the opportunity to benefit from having your data be yours so you can move it elsewhere, not just be something that's owned by a particular platform? And so that conversation is something that will be front and center even before the longer term conversations about the future of work.
Right. Did you meet Maya from Facebook? She's right here. Let's turn to the innovation part, to the for good part, because we are going to lose you right on time. What are the other imperatives? We talked about how this was in some ways a panel about these acute innovation needs, and clearly housing and equity and transportation have been first and foremost all day here today. Anybody can jump in here, but where do we need to start? Mayor, if you don't answer, I'm going to call on people. It's just, we don't have this kind of time.
You know, one of the things that we were told about this wave of our economy was that we would all become specialists, that we would all be people that knew a lot about one little thing. And I think that that has hurt us, because I think where we've erred is we have lost the understanding of the interconnectivity of everything. While you were off working on transportation solutions and you were off working on housing solutions, you did not talk to each other to discover that you were both screwing each other, okay? And never mind climate change. So this, I know it kind of hurts our heads and it's counter to the way that the economy has developed, but to move more aggressively into that space where we really look at the total picture and how our different problems are interacting against each other, I think that is the only way we're going to actually accomplish that good part. And we have enough photo sharing apps. I think we're good on that.
This does raise an interesting question for you, Kevin, actually, which is, you talked about the time that people will get back. Some of that time, though, will be in their houses. Like, how do we address this idea that there are people who are living essentially parallel virtual lives within communities?
As a mother of a 13-year-old, there is a special ring in hell for whoever invented Fortnite.
Yeah. They're not here, are they? Okay, good. So, how do you build community when some people are just going to get to stay in their lives or their houses and play Fortnite?
I mean, I think one of the...
Mine's 12. We'll talk.
One of the really exciting thing about robotics is that it is a very physical thing, right? It's not writing code behind a screen necessarily. There's vehicles out there doing something interesting. You see programs like First Robotics training the next wave of it's like huge STEM work, and that kind of thing is something that attracts people who might otherwise be playing video games. But I think ultimately it really is people's choice to do what they're going to do with their time. I think if they have interesting things to do out in the space, if their spaces are nice to live in, as we see e-commerce rising and stores going more and more online, what do we do with that space? How do we create sort of community spaces where we can all get together? I think that's how we it's human connection, right? It's getting together and talking to each other and being outside in activities that are real and physical.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from our perspective, when we've been thinking about these problems and how they do dovetail with other issues. So, for instance, we believe that with, vehicles such as ours that'll be shared autonomous electric vehicles, that will greatly reduce the need for parking over time as more and more people move away from private car ownership. And we're already starting to see some of that, particularly in urban environments like San Francisco. And with that, there's an ability to work with government and to work with communities to reclaim that space and make it a more inviting place that Kevin's talking about. And these are the types of policies that at the local level that you can begin to really, influence actions of the community, influence people to get back out into the community, and you provide them a welcoming space, a space where it's designed around them and designed perhaps to be more green and more accessible. I think these actions, it's funny, a lot of times I mention this and people tell me, oh, it's a very Pollyannish view of it. But I think it's yes, it's optimistic, but I think that's part of what innovation and technology is about, is bringing a new optimism and a way to address issues in a new way that can influence people and the decisions they make in a positive direction.
Stephen, I feel like I see you shaking your head just a tiny bit right there.
Oh, I'm thinking. I do that when I think, I guess. And part of this was I'm just kind of running through how much of this is a zoning problem, how much of this is, cities are like the ultimate ecosystem, where you are having to connect all these disparate things, right? And so if you're trying to be proactive about the way that you control that, and you're having to deal with things like, actually a lot of neighborhoods aren't that nice to be in, and a park isn't going to get you there. It's a lot more systemic, right? And it's going to take a really fundamental shift in the way that we're investing in cities to make that kind of shift work for everybody. It is this like, somehow we have to arm our cities with better decision-making tools, and they have to be able to access those more quickly. And so the last thing I was shaking my head about was how much data science has failed, actually, I think, both for the private sector, but especially for the public sector.
Just as a reminder, that's his whole job.
Yeah, right. We're getting better at it, but mostly because of what the mayor was saying. Because we're thinking of this as specialists instead of as generalists. And so, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? And let's work backward into the data. Let's work backward into the structures that we can establish to better guide that. And it all starts with having a better sense of what the real problem is, and then kind of working backwards from there. And all of us on the tech side are often kind of coming at it from the other direction, and so that's where the partnership part of this is so critical.
I mean, one thing I'd like to see is more innovation that's not designed around making people who went to the same Stanford fraternity or Harvard Finals clubs lives easier and more convenient so that they can work longer. Mm-hmm. There are large populations, even in this state, that are not benefiting from all of what's going on. We're sitting in the wealthiest state in the country in Silicon Valley and the poorest state in the Central Valley 100 miles away. Why can't we have innovation that works for the population that is aging very rapidly in this country and in this state? Mm-hmm. Why can't we have innovation that is designed around making the person who's struggling to make ends meet, and whether that's in West Oakland or East Palo Alto or Stockton or Fresno or Riverside work? Those are the kinds of innovations that we need, and I think there's an opportunity to help encourage that. If most people who go into tech because they want to make the world a better place. They don't go in it because their answer is they want to cash out on the first chance they can and then go play golf for the rest of their lives. So how do we encourage more of that to be part of the ethos of what tech for good can be?
Robert, so practically, and this is actually one of our questions, which also include, by the way, Libby, you're awesome. Just as a comment on the little card I got. That's what it says.
I hope that's not a question,
Great.
right? That's
not a question.
Assertion,
no,
right?
Just a brief editorializing from the audience.
That was mine.
But this is also one of our questions and mine, which is practically speaking, how do you start this conversation? Your job is public policy at a tech company. You've had that job at other tech companies. Mayor Schaaf, do you have a chief technology officer? Like, how do these conversations start? I'll come back to you and start with you, Robert. Yeah.
From my end, it's one of the reasons that I'm constantly on an airplane somewhere. I think you need to go in and talk about who you are, right? Why you're here, what you're doing. To me, I often tell this to my wife, who's also astounded that people think I have smart things to say. That it's not magic, right? I mean, this is about, to me, a lot about how you relate to people and being decent and honest and transparent in what you're doing. And doesn't always mean you're going to agree. Doesn't mean that things are easy. But for me, my whole experience has been, you go in and you talk to the people and you let them know this is my company. This is what I'm doing. This is our vision. This is where we see things going. Now, the funny thing in the tech space is that changes, right? I might have that conversation in April, but by the time June rolls around, something has changed. And so you have to you have to keep up that dialogue. And so to me, it's nothing fancy. You go in and you talk about it. But those conversations aren't always easy, right? Mm-hmm. Because there are people that are either skeptical or they've heard things that make them frightened of what particularly emerging technology in the transportation space is doing, or they're worried about larger issues, about the systemic issues that have been mentioned here. And you try to give them a sense of where you think you fit in, how you might address some of these issues, and perhaps where you can help to build bridges amongst the other people in the space as well. Now, that's not how everybody does it, but that's how I do it. It's why some companies want me to represent them and others don't, right? I mean, there are different ways to handle this.
So who, for our policymakers here, for our public officials, Lenny, who advises the government on technology? Who's the liaison for this? We're getting super tactical now. It's part of our therapy.
A large number of people. You know, we have the governor actually was the mayor of San Francisco and is deeply connected into that community. So you can bet he's got a lot of people sending him texts about what he should be doing about those topics. The harder part is how do you translate that into an integrated approach to deal with it? And so, and there's a big opportunity to do that. I think having a point of view in a place like California about how do we accelerate the development of technology and innovation for good is a really important issue, not just for California, but for the country. And so that's the challenge.
I mean, I would love to send him a text, but is there an office? You know, like, is there an official engagement strategy?
There is an office, which is the Office of Business and Economic Development, which I oversee. That's one. And we are also creating, was announced in the budget, an Office of Digital Innovation that is intended to help accelerate the speed with which government innovates, as the mayor was saying. You can't have a government that's effective in this environment when the technology procurement cycle is longer than the technology cycle. So it would be helpful if we bring some of that innovation into government as well.
And then, Mayor, how about you and your office, and then also how you balance that against all of the other needs of any city, let alone Oakland?
So I'll hit three things very quickly. One, we're very strapped in a city like Oakland. Just so you know that my budget is 1/11th the size of the budget of the city of San Francisco. 1/11th. Yes, Ed, 1/11th. Secondly, I do want to commend organizations like Code for America. I feel like I met you through Code for America. I always blame Jen Polka for the fact that I am the mayor of Oakland because she was one of the first people that gave me the idea. So I think, again, these organizations that are in that space are extremely exciting and necessary. Third, because of the pace of the procurement process, I've done what a lot of mayors have done, which is formed an independent nonprofit. In Oakland, it's called the Oakland Fund for Public Innovation. And because it's outside the government, it gives us a space where we can move rapidly, we can iterate, we can, again, do crazy, stupid things. And if they work, then we bring them back into government. And so, for example, our cabin community model, which has been really effective at addressing street encampments, is something that we entirely funded privately, because when I first started telling my other public officials about it, they're like, what, you're going to put human beings in tough sheds? I'm like, yeah. It's going to be great. There was no way they were going to let me do that. But we were able to raise the private money, demonstrate that it was phenomenally successful. We had amazing outcomes, and it was very humane and dignified way to treat our fellow human beings, because we had a place and a space outside of government to do the pilot, to do the test, and then to start scaling. And then the last thing I'll say, which is maybe not what you wanted me to touch on, it is so important that we all have proximity to the people that we are trying to serve. How many people in this audience have either given birth to a child or have witnessed a woman giving birth to a child? Good, I'm glad. Was it a pleasant experience? It's one of the most frightening, terrifying things that a person can go through. And when you've had that baby, you want the entire world to go down on its knees to make that child safe and cared for, correct? Like there's an instinct that comes out of you that is not to be believed. A few months ago, a homeless woman in Oakland gave birth to her baby by herself in her car. And I have continually lost my mind over that fact, that in the very wealthiest region in the whole, arguably in the whole world, that is happening in our community. And so, and Justin from my office can tell you, we force ourselves to be in proximity, to spend time with our unhoused residents, to talk with them, to hear their life stories, to really be close to the people we are serving. We cannot be effective in creating good solutions if we just sit in fancy panels and go on retreats together. We do have to be in community, listening, not just talking.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't really know where to go from that. But luckily, we have no time left. Am I right? Thank you, everyone, to our panel, and for your excellent tactical questions. I know that went by fast, but thanks for coming today.
And thank you, Molly, again for doing this. You know, I've been terrible at introducing our moderators, but Molly has a rich history in this area. So from CNET to here. So thank you for being here, and thank you all your panelists for being here. Really appreciate it. So you know, we have a little bit of activity left to go, and so what I want to do is kind of just ask you one more question: has your opinion changed? And so, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you to kind of talk to me about this idea of innovate for good. But before we do that, I want to present an award, and if some of our USF staff could actually get the awardee and make sure he's in the room. Every year, as a part of this conference, we like to give an award for leadership in social innovation and social thought. And Dean Davis, as we began, talked about Orrin Harari, a professor of management here at University of San Francisco, who really emblematized this idea of innovation and bridged theory to practice in this area of conscious leadership and social innovation. And last year, we gave this award to Joel Solheim, CEO of Ben & Jerry's. And before that, we gave it to a gentleman named David Batstone, who happens to be on the USF faculty and has built a career based on solving refugee crises and human trafficking in terms of on a global scale. And this year, as you've noticed, we focused on this idea of how do we solve some of the urban challenges that our cities face? How do we face and how do we innovate that from a finance standpoint, from a philanthropic standpoint, from a technology standpoint? And so this year, we have opportunity to give someone an award to someone who's really built a career in that area. And we probably did not sing his praises enough because it's been multi-sector, it's been cross-sector, and he's still doing it. So I asked a couple questions to people that know this gentleman, and some of the things I got were also full of integrity, class act, wonderful human being. So without further ado, I want to invite forward Mr. Maurice Jones to the stage so we can give you the Harari Award for Conscious Leadership. Thank you, Maurice. And let me get your award. Which did arrive.
Nice. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And if you would like to make any remarks, you're more than welcome.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for that kind reception. Conscious Leadership and Social Innovation Award. I'm not worthy of this. That's what I would tell you. I used to work in Washington, D.C. I was the deputy secretary at HUD. Every morning before I would go into work, I would get up and go running down Wisconsin Avenue. If you know Washington, D.C., I used to run past the National Cathedral. Beautiful. First day I went running, and this was April, I saw this gentleman in a bus stop, and as I got closer, I realized it was a homeless guy. As I got closer, I'm running. I'm terrible as a runner. He looks up at me and he goes, "Is that the best you can do?" And then he turned his back on me. Right? He was so disgusted that I was so fat. I ran on. This went on for months. In fact, about a month in, he saw me coming and he said, "Okay, you're doing better." For lack of let's call him John. John and I became acquaintances. I knew that John had been homeless in New York and Baltimore, now D.C. I knew that John didn't want to go into a shelter. I told him about my family, etc. One cold morning, I got up, same routine. It was in December, and I ran to that bus stop, and there was no John. And I never saw John again. You know, I don't know whether John, he may have gone to Richmond. He may have gone into a shelter, but he also may have died from frostbite. It was below freezing. The day that I really deserve this will be the day, well, let me put it this way. I have a 16-year-old daughter. The first day that I saw her in that bus stop would have been the last day, right? I would have stopped everything, and I would have done everything to get her into housing. The day that I deserve this award will be the day that I see in the face of John the face of my daughter. That's our invitation. What we need is to be able to see the face of our loved ones and everybody in need. If we can do that, we'll all really deserve this. So I'll accept it, but I'll accept it knowing that you probably just didn't have anybody else to give it to.
Man, one Southerner to another. You know, I don't know that we're going to eclipse that call to action, but one of the things I do want to emphasize is that we spend a lot of time, and this year and last year, I've had the opportunity to be at University of San Francisco, and one of the things conversations I've had with Dean Davis and my faculty colleagues is this idea of urban sustainability, that it really is about this sustaining our economies, sustaining our environment, but also addressing some of the social justice issues that we face. And just to hear Mayor Schaaf and Molly and all these panelists and all of you really talk about your kids and sustaining it for them and for your fellow human beings, I think is a great call to action. And I think that's one of the great takeaways that we can hear from Maurice, as well as from every panelist who is here, and investing in our future. And so I want to leave with that, but I also want to leave with two kind of takeaways that I heard, particularly from this last panel, but I heard echo through. And this is this idea of partnership, and making space for dialogue. And what I heard from almost every panelist was it wasn't just dialogue, that it was connecting and listening. So, and I think that we got this from Maurice too, is that he is a listener. And that's one of the things that I took away from the conversations of people. And we had other options, by the way, but we did hear that as a leader, you need to be a great listener. To create change, you have to be listening to the people around you and to be attentive to the needs of the people around you, to shape what is livability, what is a sustainable urban environment. And I think the second takeaway I think is really important, and again goes back to the call to action that Mr. Jones kindly gave us, which is let's be tactical. Let's do something. Let's leave this room and make something happen. So with that, rather than actually go back to any interactive poll, I'd like you to find something to write on, whether or not it's your digital device or a tacit piece of paper. And my students know that I do this to them all the time. I want us to actually to write something down. And I want us to write down, Stephen Hardy from mySidewalk actually said something here that really resonated to me. He said, well, can we do these little micro experiments? Can we be innovators even on our own block? What can we do to innovate for good? So I'd like to say that we're all innovators in this room, that each of you are doing something to create change and to innovate for good. So what I'd like you to do with our couple minutes remaining is to write down, what is that one thing that you're going to do tomorrow to start innovating for good? So let's take a couple minutes, we'll do that, and we'll bid us adieu. All right, as you can see, I'm no stranger to silence. So hopefully everyone has had a chance to just envision what they can do tomorrow to innovate the space that they live in, to innovate for good, to make change within their own lives and their own domain. I'll remind you that you came in here with kind of your vision of Innovate for Good. That may have changed, that may have evolved, but hopefully you can take away some lesson today that can help you shape what is your world around you. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you to Dean Davis, Provost Heller for making this happen. We've had a lot of volunteers that made this happen. Everyone you saw on this stage did this for free. They donated their time, so thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club. We really appreciate this partnership we have with you. Let's shape this world for good going forward. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next year.